Okay, why people think they are right. This is a very interesting quote that I think will say a lot about what we need to understand about what's going on at the moment. This is from Sherlock Holmes. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. Now, really what's going on is that most people now are obtaining their conclusions and their theories from a pre-prepared script given to them by the media. It's not really that the data is providing that conclusion. So in fact, what's going on is that people are twisting the data to actually suit their conclusions. And that's what we're seeing really constantly. And what happens is then people end up having a story in their mind. And what happens is, because of confirmation bias, all the facts start to match the story that they have in their mind. So what we've really got, we're going to look at the life of Joe today and look at why Joe always thinks he's right. So in this slide that we commonly use, we have Jane on the left and we've got Joe on the right. Now, Jane doesn't believe much about the narrative. She's always challenging it. Joe is very much behind the narrative as a general rule. And what happens is that when Jane presents a fact, as we've looked at a number of times, it generally just bounces back. And this confuses Jane as she wonders why this is the case. And of course, there's things going on because both Jane and Joe have different beliefs. If they are presented with information that's contrary to the other person's viewpoint, what happens is that they hang on to their existing beliefs even stronger. So by Jane presenting facts that differ from Joe, Joe will actually want his facts to be more truthful. So what we're actually doing in a conversation is that people are standing on a soapbox and they're projecting their viewpoint into the conversation. So effectively what's going on is that most people end up in a game of table tennis. The conversation is really about scoring points. And when you're in this kind of dynamic, it is almost impossible to get the other person to see reason of any data that you will share. This we go into in a number of other presentations, but what we'll look at today is why does Joe think he's right all the time? And it's not really just Joe, it's generally the way the brain works. So as we talk about, information and meaning does not exist in a vacuum. And to give us a graphical representation of what we mean by this, if we have Jane and Joe and they're standing on their representative soapboxes, not only do they project their soapbox into the world, and the soapbox represents the reservoir of all the information, the beliefs, the facts, how they see the world. We also see everything in the world through those filters. So if we look at Joe's viewpoint of the world, Joe, for instance, believes the media reports. He thinks the government serves him and has his best interests at heart. He thinks if everyone's doing it, it must be good. He thinks that certain things when he's sold are safe. He trusts authorities and people wearing suits and ties, and he thinks there's a scientific consensus. Jane, on the other hand, knows that there's huge amounts of censorship. She knows that there's conflicts of interest. She knows that these non-government organizations have their fingers in all these pies. She knows that media is effectively a corporation and an advertising wing of many corporations. She distrusts the government on many situations, and she thinks that science can be influenced just as much as any other industry. So every single fact that Jane and Joe see, they will see from a very different viewpoint. So we think that a fact is a fact, 2 + 2 = 4, but some people literally will see it equaling 5 if they're told so a number of times. And this is really key. So then what we're going to look at is really these things in, say, Joe's minds are effectively mental objects. So there's stories and their beliefs and all these things. They're effectively pictures of how Joe views the world. So the life of Joe really is Joe got his PhD in mathematics and continued to enjoy getting things right. Every time he did, was a good boy, he got, commended. Every time he did something bad, he was scolded. So this was really a training to comply, really to be, rewarded for complying and to be, carrot and stick, as it were. Now, on driving to work, Joe noticed that there were maniacs driving too fast and idiots driving too slow. Why couldn't people just learn to drive the way that he drives? When it comes to his students, one of his students, James, got straight A's. So Joe was priding himself on what a good tutor he is, but Sarah failed her exams. So Joe was thinking that Sarah can't have put in enough work. This is known as the self-serving bias. And this is where we positively attribute successes to us, but failures to situations or others. His mother was angry with him for not phoning, but mother, I've been busy. So Joe comforts himself that actually he is respectful, but he was just very busy. It was the situation that caused this negative behavior, he tells himself. This again is the self-service bias in operation. Joe's new work colleague, Mary, she didn't phone or do what she was going to do when she said she was. So Joe was thinking that Mary was a disrespectful person. This is actually the fundamental attribution bias. And it sounds complex, but it's really just the tendency to overestimate other people's behavior being down to their personality. But yet when we do something wrong, it's actually the situation. And this is just a natural thing that happens again in the brain. So another thing that's quite key is Joe's self-image. Now, what's going on is we're always trying to maintain a positive self-image because it's quite important. And then the question is, why do we do that? And it really comes from, in a number of the other presentations, we've talked about needs and wants. And there's 5 basic needs, and 3 of them we're going to look at in this respect is that Joe has a need to be socially accepted. Okay, he also has a need to be part of groups, and he has a need to influence others. So effectively, by changing his profile picture, wearing masks, doing everything that society tells us is acceptable, is going to reinforce Joe's self-image. And of course, there is so much propaganda around this. So effectively, the media and the governments were laying out what's socially accepted and pretty much using these deep needs that a lot of people wouldn't see beyond them. And there was instances of actually altering Joe's self-image. So this thing in the UK where people on a Thursday night went out and clapped to the sky, that is using a psychological bias that when Joe claps or does any minor, such as signing a petition, he will change his self-image around that concept. And it's very interesting because once Joe clapped for the NHS, not only did he then support them more, but his neighbours that didn't clap, he then kind of socially rejected them. Now, what's interesting about this is that previously Joe was very frustrated with the NHS as he couldn't get an appointment. There was years waiting on everything, and the privatisation by vulture capitalists, all that kind of just disappeared once he was supporting the NHS. So really, when it comes to Joe's self-image, we act in ways that make us feel better about ourselves. Now that's taken from the Mindspace document, which is the government's document on how to manipulate people and get them to comply, which is given to all the government departments. Another quote from it's the greater the expectation, the greater they perform. So effectively, one of the chapters in that document talks about how ego governs so much about what we do. So much about, you know, calling people heroes and all these things was all about blowing people's egos up, knowing that full well it would get them to behave a certain way. And what's really interesting about how we see things is that 95% of people think they're better than average drivers. Now, the same figure again is 95% of professors think they're better than the average professor. So by nature, we are overestimating as a default how we are compared to average people. And that's really, when you think about needs to be accepted and to be part of groups, it's in our best interest to have a positive outlook on ourselves. Now, when it comes to Joe, what you'll see is that with this wanting to be socially accepted, wanting to be seen in a positive light, which is nothing wrong with that. But what you'll find is that people will be falling for these things of, supporting the current thing and changing their Facebook profiles, etc., because effectively they get likes and all these things off of other people, which reinforces Joe's self-image. Now, what's really interesting about this is that we strive to meet the image we have of ourselves, and really, but effectively we have 2 images. We have the conscious self-image of ourselves, and we also have the unconscious self-image. And if they differ, that's when you'll see people wanting to do something but not doing it. And we won't be going into that today, but another session we go into the unconscious image. But effectively, what we find ourselves in a situation is that the default setting for the brain is, number one, a conviction that our own perceptions, beliefs, feelings, preferences are realistic and objective, and that others will and should share them. So Joe, really, this is how he sees things. He's correct, and everyone else should adopt his viewpoint, which is anybody on this call that's had any conversations with people that believe the narrative, this is what you will witness. The second thing, which obviously we share more than others, is this undue optimism about our ability to persuade those that disagree with us or don't share our feelings and priorities, including the other side in conflict. So really, they've just got to see things the way we see them, and that's going to be relatively easy. It's obviously not. But here's the third thing. If they don't share our viewpoints, then we negatively attribute to those. Effectively, we say they're acting irrational, they're joined a cult, etc. And the bottom line is they are idiots. So what you'll find is that both sides of an argument, by default, will consider themselves to be correct. And of course, then they will think that all they've got to do is show the other person their viewpoint, and they will change their viewpoint. And the third thing is, if they don't, they're idiots. Now, this is, to really bear in mind, this is the default setting. Anyone that understands that they need to look into facts and detail things, and research a lot, will overcome this. And that's the thing where I think those challenging the narrative, on average, will have done far more research than those that defend the narrative. But not only will they have done far more research, they would have done far more robust research. They will also be aware that they're being manipulated, and etc. So I think by nature, there's far more chance that someone challenging the narrative will be correct, but you will also see this mindset on all sides of the narrative. And one of the biggest problems is actually to talk about sides. Science isn't about sides. Science is about not having a side, starting with the data and then coming to a conclusion. The problem with having sides is that you've already on a side, and then the data is being searched to match that conclusion. And yeah, I think that the truth will naturally arise and show us that, I think challenging the narrative is the right side. So this is a very interesting quote, which is, it's usually futile to try to talk facts and analysis to people who join a sense of moral superiority in their ignorance. So those people that really haven't done any research but are told they're following the science really will, from their self-image, see themselves as superior, and then they will just obviously be quite derogatory about anyone that disagrees with them, as per the previous slide. So why does Joe think he's right? Well, it helps meets his needs and maintains the status quo. The education system will build self-esteem in certain ways, which provides a false sense of security. So there's a lot of research now that's showing that self-esteem is quite important, but in fact, it can be problematic if it's just the self-esteem without the things that we really would provide a good self-esteem. So there's other things like sort of self-humbleness that are really key. And it's really the default mold our brains take. Now, what's really interesting is that we just assume that whatever's in our unconscious mind is correct as a default mode. And of course, science is really about questioning our own assumptions. So to the conscious mind, excuse me, what resides in the unconscious mind is truth for most people. Finding out something isn't true is very uncomfortable, and deceiving ourselves can sometimes be easier. And that's why when one of the greatest scientists of all said the first principle is you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So I think anyone that's really begun to challenge things and the way the system and the world works over the last few years has realized that a lot of things they thought were true are not true. And this has provided a real growth opportunity for many, many people. So coming back to it now, that when Jane and Joe are having this conversation, we will see that it's really this viewpoint where they share different filters of the world. Okay? And it's these gross mental objects that sit in the mind, which are going to govern the meaning of the fact that Joe looks at. okay? To ask why Joe believes something is actually not a very useful question, because what that will do is that will elicit the ego in Joe to basically rationalize and justify why he believes what he believes. What you can do is actually just ask him to explain what he believes. And then what will happen will be very interesting. This is something we spoke about on another call, which is then what will happen is Joe will suddenly realize, in most instances, that he actually doesn't know what he thought he knew. And in fact, it will really open up the chance to grow more. And of course, if we start to direct our focus to what is actually the filters that are governing Joe to see things the way he's seeing them, rather than providing him more of these things, if that makes sense, because by all these raw facts are not going to go into his conscious mind, particularly if they disagree with what's in his unconscious mind. However, if we can present things in a certain way, and we spoke on other presentations how to do this, particularly through stories, metaphors, and asking very specific questions, we can actually start to open up Joe's filters, bring them into his conscious awareness, and for him to see that actually a lot of the things that he believes might not be very wise. So hopefully that starts to, because this is a very complex subject on why people believe what they believe, but hopefully that should give us a nice kind of overview of why Joe is seeing things the way he's seeing them. It's effectively really that his belief systems throughout his life have set up, filters to the world. And what happens is that we tend to see any event through those filters. So if we don't believe something exists, our brain will literally exclude it. So we're effectively setting up certain, glasses that will only see certain things. So in summary, really, Joe is by default going to think he's right, whatever's in his unconscious mind. And the fact that the propaganda and the behavioral sciences has become so advanced that it can actually have an effect on Joe's unconscious mind without Joe knowing about it, you could literally, and have in instances, move Joe from being, quite a rational person into being almost a fascist in a few years. And I think we've seen that certainly in a lot of instances. So on the project, we look to do three things, which is one, to understand how to have a good conversation. And we've identified about 20 things that will need to be accounted for in order to create a very good situation to have good conversations. How do we effectively message? How do we present information and facts in a way that people can absorb them? There's really a navigating of an obstacle course. And lastly, how we're influenced, which is obviously very key. And I think many people beginning to understand that we've been influenced significantly over the last few years. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing, but yeah, presentations and the course are free at the moment. If you have benefited and would like to donate, please do so. We're going to have to make some changes to the project to continue to sustain ourselves. But if you wish to contact me, you can do so at info@reachingpeople.net. So